Hello and welcome. It's so wonderful to see so many people here at this event. My name is Ann Dodge. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at the Art of Captivity Global Book Launch. I'm the Executive Director here at the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation at the University of Chicago, and we are a hub for urban science, training the next generation of urban scholars. A few details about this event. For our Spanish language speakers, note that closed captioning is provided through the link in the chat. We also encourage you to download the Interprify app, works on both iOS and Android, and then enter the event code, which is MIUrban 2021, to listen to this event in Spanish, here, I'll hold this, through your mobile phone. We will also be taking Q&A through the Q&A function, not the chat function. So if you can find the Q&A function, be sure to add your questions there anytime during the event, and we will put them to the speakers at the end of the event. So The Art of Captivity is a new bilingual Spanish-English photography book published by University of Toronto Press that explores the Pentecostal drug rehabilitation centers of Guatemala City and those held inside those centers, often against their will. Today, we're very excited to have the authors of The Art of Captivity share their latest book, a stunning work of visual ethnography, as well as a special guest who will lead the discussion. First, we have with us Kevin O'Neill, a professor in the Department for the Study of Religion and director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. A cultural anthropologist, Kevin has written several books on the politics of Pentecostalism in Guatemala City, including City of God, Secure the Soul, and Hunted, published by UChicago Press. Next, we have our very own Mansueto Institute Fellow, Benjamin Fogarty Valenzuela. Benjamin is a Mansueto Fellow and a sociology scholar here at the University of Chicago. A cultural anthropologist, a photographer, Benjamin holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from Princeton University. And at UChicago, he teaches a course on ethnographic methods and organizes the Chicago Ethnography Incubator. We're very proud to call Benji a part of the Mansueto team. And finally, we have the esteemed John Lee Anderson with us. A staff writer at The New Yorker, John Lee Anderson began contributing to the magazine in 1998. And since then, he's covered numerous conflicts around the world and has reported extensively from Latin America, writing about Rio de Janeiro's gangs, the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, an isolated tribe in Peru's Amazon, a Caracas slum, among other subjects, and has written profiles of Augusto Pinochet, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So he's the author of several books, including, lots, Che Guevara, Guerrilla's Journey in the Insurgent World, The Fall of Baghdad, and The Lion's Grave Dispatches from Afghanistan. So thank you, John Lee, for being with us today, for guiding us through this conversation to follow the presentations. And now let me hand it over to Kevin to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne. And if I could say thanks to the team at the Mansueto Institute, Diana Petty and Grace Chung have all done a tremendous amount of work for this event, and of course also John Lee Anderson for joining us today. It's a fantastic honor to be a part of this. Art of Captivity is an exciting moment for Benjamin and myself. It's the culmination of more than a decade of research in Guatemala. Right now, I think by way of introduction, it's important to kind of give a little bit of context, and I'll just do a few minutes of that, and then hand it over to Benjamin to introduce the project even more. Right now, I'm going to share screen just so that I can show you a few images that come from the book. So as Anne mentioned, I'm an anthropologist. I work and have worked in Guatemala City in particular, for roughly 20 years. And for the last 10 or so, I have been thinking about the questions of these drug rehabilitation centers. As you can see here, this is an image from the book from one of Benjamin's many, and it shows what these centers largely are. They are informal, largely unregulated, and they hold drug users inside of them, oftentimes for very long stretches of time, months and sometimes for years. They also do so against the will of these drug users. What many people don't realize is that Guatemala today is over half Pentecostal Christian. meaning that this one time long-standing Catholic country has a new kind of Christianity. The Christianity that the country is experiencing right now is relatively conservative. It is driven by things like morality and how to live a proper Christian life, centered on the Bible. And it's propelled by this sense of salvation, not just of individual salvation, but also saving the country of Guatemala. And what my last 20 years as an anthropologist working in Guatemala has engaged is this idea that the idea of salvation is not an abstract ambition for many of these Pentecostals. It involves very concrete efforts at intervention. And when it comes to the war on drugs, and Guatemala has experienced over the last 10 years a shifting relationship in the war on drugs, Pentecostals have made the decision to take action. And these drug rehabilitation centers have been the principal means by which they've engaged this problem of drug use. This is another image from Benjamin, and it shows the kind of setting that these centers provide drug users. It's driven by an imperative to confess, a reliance on testimony, but also you can get a sense of how kind of intimate these spaces are. There's not a tremendous amount of room to be kind of held inside these centers for a great deal of time can be difficult. And so Benjamin and myself, over more than a decade, have taken the time to engage dozens of these centers throughout the city. And while we began working together in 2010, because a professor of his from Columbia University put us into contact, the possibility of that research shifted immediately, where my own research was driven by an interest in these centers and questions of specifically carceration and theology and the kind of politics that were emerging in Guatemala. Benjamin's kind of anthropological acumen and his ability to be an ethnographer helped that project tremendously, but it also his ability and his skill as a photographer set up a new dynamic. And that's where Art of Captivity comes from, a collaboration with Benjamin, both ethnographic and photographic, in which the visual dimension of these centers came into full view. And actually, Benjamin, if you'd like to kind of jump in right now and talk about, what photography allowed us to do, both with this book and even beyond.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you everybody who's watching. It's really special to be here sharing this project with you all. As an anthropologist who I was raised in Guatemala, so this project is very dear to my heart and very important for me. And another thing that's very dear to my heart is photography. And it's been a really central part of my field work for various important reasons. I'll mention a few as they relate to the book. The first reason stems from my commitment to political photographic work that expands meaning, allowing for multiple interpretations, where a shared witnessing of the images can create a political community and a conversation, as opposed to another understanding of photography as showing only one true version of reality that flattens thought and forecloses multiple interpretations. So what this meant during fieldwork was that engaging these centers photographically allowed us to expand our frame and realize that these centers are a lot of things, right? One glance tells us that they're extrajudicial sites of incarceration and detention. Upon closer inspection, we find that there are resources for rather desperate families without recourse to public health services. Also, upon closer inspection, there are places where the creative production of art allows users to create a shared sense of meaning and to imagine their lives and country beyond a state of captivity. Another important part about photography in the book is that it allowed us to to engage with, and listen to the people being held inside these centers in ways that ordinary visits and interviews would not. They, through extensive conversations and engagement with the people held inside of these centers, we understood how they wanted the centers to be seen, but also how they themselves would like to be represented, photographed, and understood. So we had very long conversations with these men about the photographs that eventually appeared in our book, and developed enduring ties with people who entered and exited these centers, continuing to tell their stories afterward as they circulated the city, and understanding and really taking seriously their ideas about the centers. And then the third thing to say is that photography has allowed this research to be more public facing than more academic anthropological work. Kevin and I have curated several photography exhibitions in Guatemala City and the US Northeast. And this allowed us to stage conversations between pastors, the Ministry of Health, and other academics. Those formerly held inside these centers were also part of these conversations. And we staged such conversations in the US as well with advocacy groups and with journalists. And part of what excites me a lot about this book is that we plan on following this collaborative aspect and potential for public engagement, and use the book as a platform, following it back into the world and continuing to cultivate these political communities, develop these difficult conversations about the war on drugs, incarceration, and health that are relatively incipient in Central America. Another thing to mention is the importance of this book being printed in both English and Spanish. Like the photographs that don't require a linguistic proficiency to understand and to relate with, so too is the text bilingual. And we chose very intentionally to keep the bilingual side by side, so as to, rather than making sort of two editions, in order to tell a dual story that interpolates and sort of resonates with both English and Spanish speakers, that talks to them about a shared history, right? And a shared complicitly at a transnational level. And then lastly, I'll just close by saying really quick that we've curated an online exhibition recently, which we'll post a link to in the chat, so for you guys to check it out at some point. And obviously the pandemic limits what we can do in terms of exhibitions, but we really tried to push the boundaries and do a little bit of innovating when it comes to creating a sort of experiment in creative production, about what it sort of means to the exhibition sort of grapples with what it means to view art in what has felt like an enduring state of captivity for all of us, and how to do so with the subjects of our research in mind. So I think I'll hand it over to John to start up the broader conversation.
Hello, everyone. Have I come into view? Yeah, not yet. There we go.
Not yet.
So hello, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm John Lee Anderson, and here at the invitation of Kevin and Benji and the Mansueto Institute, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you. And I just want to say how fascinated I am with this project, and that's what motivated me to join in today. When Kevin and Benjamin reached out to me and sent me their work, I was taken aback, I guess is the best word. I hadn't seen anything quite like this. And I've spent many years, decades really, in Latin America, off and on, reporting amongst all kinds of people, and in many cases, amongst people living on the margins or in the worst of conditions, and at times in war as well, including in Guatemala. And so this project resonated very deeply with me because for a number of reasons, both the evangelical side of it, the Pentecostalist, and the captivity. And it's rare, I think, to see. And I suppose that's what I found shocking, that took me aback initially. It was the syncretism, the union of these two realities before our noses, right there in plain view. The idea that there's 150 of these centers of detention really in the capital city of Guatemala is pretty shocking, with hundreds and hundreds of men inside them. And the idea that Kevin and Benjamin spent over a decade going in and out, hanging out, interviewing, getting to know the inmates and also the directors, who clearly from the book I know represented a whole range of human beings, from the true believers to the villainous, and we'll get to that, was extremely intriguing. And I just want to say, one of the very first things I did as a journalist nearly 40 years ago now was to travel to Guatemala at the time when the late former dictator, Efrain Rios Montt, a born-again Christian, was in power. And the terror that had been underway, counterinsurgent terror in the name of anti-communism that had been underway already for 2 decades, mostly in the countryside and mostly in the city and somewhat selectively outside, then went full force into the Guatemalan highlands under Rios Montt. I witnessed pretty horrific scenarios in the immediate aftermath of massacres that were taking place while I was there. What one of the most enduring images is that of terrorized indigenous Guatemalan highlanders in this sort of wasteland of villages and farms with white flags. And then eventually the national flag, to show that they were with the government in this kind of siege of garrisons of the military in bivouacs along the roads. And then the arrival of evangelical preachers. It was clear that Efrain Rios Montt, who was a born-again Christian, was, he was a warrior priest. There was this idea of a warrior pastor. He was a warrior of God. This is the language he used. And I recall, and Catholic priests, because of liberation theology, were being killed in some cases. And there was a kind of shift that began to take place while I was there during my visits, where American evangelicals began to arrive, bringing humanitarian aid essentially to the survivors of the Army's massacres. And there was about a decade where I didn't go to Guatemala. And when I returned then there in the early 90s, must have been around 1991, the war was still underway. There were now indigenous evangelicals. I went to churches where I saw, indigenous people, playing electric guitar, kind of wall of sound, Pentecostalism, aping what they might have seen brought to them by the United States, falling in the aisles, speaking in tongues, all of that stuff that was not at all Guatemalan. And I deduced that what had happened was so vast, so devastating to Guatemalans living in the war zone, that they had shifted their allegiances to the victor, to prosperity religion, to that associated with the winning side. And this is a very kind of this is an academic conclusion I came to, but it's one I felt quite strongly about. In the years since then, throughout Latin America, I've noticed the spread of Pentecostalism. Evangelical Pentecostalism has made huge inroads in countries like Brazil. The story I'm working on now, in fact, as I was telling the authors just the other day, is in fact about that. I would call it evangelicos malandros. It's, evangelical villains, or vice versa. And I've spent time with people like this in Venezuela, in Brazil, where you have an implosion of the state. This is what we've seen throughout Latin America. And in lieu of the state, the churches very often kick in as a structure. It's also a way out for criminals to confess their sins, to have a conversion, and to appear for a time, perhaps, to be on the side of the light. And in the absence of any other effective institutions that can receive them and cradle them and incorporate them with society, again and again, I've seen how the state effectively lets this happen. So there's a kind of unholy, not pun not intended, aspect to this, which I have yet to reconcile. But it comes up again, and in fact, increasingly in my reporting in Latin America. Mexico is another one, of course, where you see the syncretism between the cartels themselves and syncretic saints, popular saints that arise out of the, out of the reality. In some cases, they're narcos themselves, who then become popular saints. So the other aspect of this that I found so fascinating was the captivity aspect, and also the title of the work, The Art of Captivity. It's quite provocative, but I think you in the course of the book and in the exhibition, the work you've done, you make it very clear that that's exactly what it is. The pastors and others who have learned who have set up this industry, have effectively honed it into a fine art of hunting, capturing, keeping, converting, sometimes genuinely, sometimes not, I guess, these hapless men, drug addicts. So, and I guess that's the and that other aspect, the captivity, is the one that I want to kind of lead in on, because again, referring to my own experience, I'm haunted myself by maybe half a dozen experiences in which, in the course of my reporting, usually unexpectedly, I found myself in the company of people I realized were captives of the people, my hosts. Sometimes these were guerrilla leaders who were holding someone they believed to be a spy, and I deduced that they were awaiting execution. In some cases, it was explicit. In other cases, they were people who had been kidnapped and were being kept as slaves, sex slaves, or other of the men, usually brutal men of war that I was spending time with. And in each of these occasions, also meeting Guatemalan peasants who had been terrorized and had been forced into strategic hamlets. And I was aware that I was, at the time I was reviewing them, or amongst them, I was effectively amongst people being held captive, being surveilled, and occasionally being picked off and disappeared. So that's the backdrop to your 20 years of work in Guatemala, Kevin. No, it was this kind of horrific butchery that has taken place over decades in Guatemala and become institutionalized in a way. So, but what I was going to say was that these experiences haunt me because suddenly you're confronted with a moral quandary. Here you are with someone being held against their will. What do you do? So that, for me, is the source of enduring fascination for your project. And I think you have addressed it well. It was my misgiving at the beginning, and reading through it and talking with you, I realized you were very, very conscious of this and dealt with it head on. And this very project is a way to deal with that. But I want to draw you out on that, each of you, if you can. You want through the project to provoke an anthropological talk about creativity and captivity. Mm-hmm. You also want to help instigate a debate about the U.S. drug war, clearly, and there are other aspects of this to be drawn out. But how did you deal, each of you, with this issue, this moral and ethical issue of visiting places of captivity?
No, it's a great, your narrative arc is extremely helpful, John Lee, and you're absolutely right that for me to arrive in 2001, that's 5 years after the signing of the 1996 peace accords. I'm very much a scholar of post-war Guatemala, and though the history you reference casts a long shadow over the capital and what we are studying here and writing about in Art of Captivity. And the question, the use of the term captivity is provocative in a sense that there are a lot of other words we could have used, incarceration, warehousing, container. Captivity as a term allows us to think about, and this, Benjamin, I wonder what you have to say about this from a photographic perspective. Captivity implies a certain kind of melodrama to the social relationship, in the sense, and you were absolutely right to signal these moments of like host and guest. The idea that captivity marks a certain kind of blurred line where, in these centers themselves, families are actively paying the pastors to pull their loved ones from the streets and hold them safe inside the center for salvation, or even just to get them out of harm's way. What Benjamin's photographic work and our collaboration with this visual anthropology, I think, allows us to talk about is that kind of melodramatic, in a very kind of positive, constructive sense, of the way that holding people becomes a way of participating in the story, this in terms of Christian redemption, but ideally about kind of imploding the Christian notion of salvation into this very kind of oftentimes very brutal situation. And your question about ethics is exceedingly important. We have always sought out audiences and try to do our best, whether it's United Nations Committee Against Torture or BBC or these public photography exhibits. This one, Benjamin, what do you think? This Art of Captivity is an effort of public-facing anthropology, but it does kind of lean on these kind of conceptual frames of captivity and art in a way to seek out a new kind of audience.
Yeah, Kevin, I think, thank you, John Lee, for your comments. Very, very, a history that resonates very deeply to bring forth. And I think as it's contextualized in the book, I think it's really great to contextualize it for our audience and sort of think about that arc. One thing to say is that in Guatemala, when you think about anthropologists taking photos, you think about photos of the disappeared from the period that you're talking about. And what we try to do as cultural anthropologists is to think about the way in which photos can become spaces to stage conversations that are sometimes at the fringes of what's thinkable or what's discussable in a very conservative space such as Central America and Guatemala. So what I see these photos doing in the book project as a whole is creating a platform upon which we can have these difficult conversations that discuss not only the past, but bring us to the present such that we can grapple seriously with the history of the present. And so that's one thing that I found happening sort of on its own during the exhibitions that we carried out. And I'm also, again, what makes me most excited about this project is precisely the ability to use it as an entrance to spaces in Guatemala City, for example, that you otherwise wouldn't get to have these conversations about the U.S. intervention, about the history of the indigenous population in Guatemala, about the war on drugs, et cetera, to sort of expand the frame that way. So that's one thing that I would say sort of up front. And another thing that I think the photographic book allows us to do is really ask difficult questions. I'm thinking, Guatemala has a colonial history that's quite spectacular in so much as you can trace the current people who have a stranglehold on power to about 15 elite families that are currently still the families that sort of control things in Guatemala. And these local elites have been complicit with the moral majority in the United States, as you very, very well pointed out, and various conservative governments that have influenced Guatemala. So what I think of is, think about Plan Merida, right? The U.S. has declared war on drugs in Central America and Mexico. That was it was $2.9 billion, of which hundreds of thousands went to Guatemala, or to Central America, to be precise. Hundreds of millions, to be precise. And that was all in the service of a largely failed war on drugs. And I think that those conversations are difficult to have when what we're doing is sort of oftentimes sort of playing into some of the cliches about Guatemala, that it's a violent place, that it's a hostile, that it's a place without a state, without institutions. And I think that part of the effort of the photography was to expand the frame, to have multiple conversations with new audiences, and in a way defy some of these rather sort of gloomy stereotypes about Central America at large. So I'll just leave it at that.
No, absolutely, really interesting, because of course I was also reflecting back on the work of journalists, journalism. You guys have a I call it a syncretic approach. I mean, you might use a different term, but this combination of ethnography, photography, anthropology. It's very interesting, and I agree that that there's a need to shake things up, to redefine boundaries, so that reframe the debate, so that these issues can be viewed differently, because clearly it's one of those insoluble. It's a miasma that doesn't get any better. Clearly, there's an aspect to the whole, both to the U.S. drug war, the spread of the narco economy and of drug addiction in Latin America, criminality through society as a means of livelihood over the past 40, 50 years. That's really very obvious and is a huge pressing problem. And this is one, very kind of an obviously urgent consequence of it. And I agree that photography, it's interesting because they're in the art aspect of your project. And at first I was willing to be skeptical because I'm a cynical journalist and I tend to approach everything from that point of view. But I was very intrigued and won over by your arguments and the fact that we are in fact debating this, and it is assisted by images. And I'm very aware that we live in a world in which, for whatever reason, imagery, photographic imagery, very often sparks off not just a social or media debate, but sometimes political action. I'm thinking of the image of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian refugee seen lying dead in the surf on a Greek island, which spurred Angela Merkel to allow 1 million refugees into Germany in the summer of 2015. It was that photograph. It was the culmination of something that was happening.
Yeah.
And there are other examples, quite a few interesting contemporary examples where world leaders who found themselves unwilling or incapable of responding to the exigencies of a predicament somewhere were spurred into action because of an image. So why not this approach?
John Lee, I mean, if I could add just to that really interesting insight, Benjamin and I have oftentimes, photography can be invoked by anthropologists to kind of add texture or to provide evidence. But what we've tried to do through this book is make sure that the actual images are themselves a kind of argument, have that kind of impact that you're referencing, not just establish, which is important, a kind of public record of what happened, but for the images themselves to advance a kind of argument about, and Benjamin and you have already mentioned these, like issues of war on drugs, issues of inequality and marginality in Central America. But like the curation of the images themselves, we hope make themselves an argument, a very accessible one.
Yeah, interesting point. I mean, I realize our time is just roaring by, and I have a number of questions I'm not going to be able to ask.
Sure.
One of the things I found moving about your project is that, you highlight a number of individuals that you got to know, people, in some cases, you clearly developed relationships with. I'm thinking of Yoser, that's the correct name, who was a kind of irredeemable addict who was in and out of these centers and was an artist. He was compelled to, he got through his days through art. His life became this work of art, in a sense, the exercise of art. But there are others. Chus, the leader of one of these houses, who was a brutal man. You called him El Cholo. And in many cases, these people are no longer with us. They died violently. How was that to deal with? That some of your principal characters died. So in some cases, as I say, shot dead. In other cases, presumably drug overdose, and in other cases, died mysteriously. This permeates. Death hangs over the lives of these men, not just captivity, but death, violent death. How has that affected you?
Yeah.
How you dealt with that?
Benjamin, I've always thought of this in your work photographically and together collaboratively, ethnographically, as a tribute and as a kind of a mode of witnessing. You're right. I mean, all three people you just mentioned are no longer with us. Yoser, Cholo, and Chus certainly are not. But Benjamin, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly what made the project just so sort of heart-wrenching. Was precisely that sort of what felt like a kind of dead end in terms of ideas, but also in terms of the precious life of these individuals who we got to know closely. And one, I guess I like to think about telling larger structural stories through the lens of their individual lives. And one of the stories that I think is really important to highlight here is the alternative paradigms for the war on drugs. And by that, I mean, for fighting the war on drugs. By that, I mean approaches that are not militarization and consisting of militarizing and scaling up the police. In many regards, very resonant with debates today about abolition, and ways in which these approaches were actually attempted by ostensibly the International Commission for Against Impunity in Guatemala. This was an international body that sought to essentially root out some of the root causes of what led to the death of these people you're talking about, John Lee. These efforts had a dramatic effect. I mean, if you look at the death rates between the years that they were the CICIG was in operation, you saw the death rate. It wasn't a dramatic drop, but it was a significant chunk of people that diminished. And so all of that to say that you look at Plan Merida, billions of dollars going into Mexico and Central America. You look at initiatives that attempt to, where the premise is not necessarily that the state has imploded or that there's a complete absence of institutions, but the premise is let's fortify and build up these institutions that are still there, and that the CICIG managed to create a lightning bolt through these institutions.
CICIG being, you might explain maybe to some of the.
Yes, CICIG being this international. Yeah, this international commission against impunity that lasted between 2007 and 2019. That was essentially an international body that would fortify national courts because the state itself could not adjudicate its sort of implosion of whatnot. So anyhow, that all that to think about, sort of using these looking into the eyes of these individual people who we lost and thinking very hard about structural solutions, as opposed to getting bogged down in this sort of depressive story about death.
Sure. One thing that comes clear from your stories here, through the vehicle of this project, is that really these are holding centers, aren't they? They're like the prisons are in so many places. Next door in El Salvador, one thinks of the Mara, who are jammed away in the prisons, with no solution in sight to the fundamental essential issues that have brought about their this way of life. Or in the case of these guys in the centers you went to, the drug addiction. You said, and the reason I say that is because at some point you say, if not most, many of the men that have been held that you met had been in multiple centers, and most were what they call in Spanish reincidentes. No, they ended back up in them, and it became a kind of way of life in some cases. I still think of the very poignant case of that one man, older man, who had burned himself, who had spent 20 odd years inside one of these places, behind solder, doors soldered shut, windows sealed off, just dantesque circumstances. And so back to the war on drugs, and Kevin, maybe over to you on that. That's clearly the underlying call. You're kind of leaving it open. You're opening the debate at the end. At the last act on this stage is, okay, so what do we do? And in fact, that is a line from your book. So what do we do?
Well, it's a parallel pursuit of my own fieldwork for over a decade has been Guatemala's carceral system. And just a few years ago, I completed a kind of a presidential report with some colleagues on drug economies in the Guatemalan prison system, from the idea thinking that maybe the bloat, because Guatemala's prison system is beyond capacity right now, maybe the bloat was due to some, a large amount of low-level drug charges, potentially. It turned out less than 1% of those held inside Guatemala's prison system are therefore drug charges, which makes, to me, perfect sense, because there is a parallel and shadow system of incarceration with these centers. And so when we think about those held inside these centers, they are people who travel between centers, but then also in between the carceral system and these centers. It's a win-win for the Guatemalan state. They don't pay anything. And families certainly prefer to put their loved ones inside of a center as opposed to a prison, no matter how difficult these centers are. As you know, John Lee, the Central American prisons are incredibly dramatic sites.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother world. But one of the things that also would routinely come about was that kind of unknown to many people is that in this kind of Central American prison system, it's actually really difficult once you're inside a prison to leave a prison. An estimated 5% of Guatemalan prisoners are inside prison right now beyond their term because they just can't get through the bureaucratic process of leaving. And people know this. And so judges at these kind of critical points will often offer the opportunity to go inside of a Pentecostal drug rehabilitation center as opposed to a prison. So there are these important switch points that kind of offload the responsibility of the state when it comes to the war on drugs onto these centers. And so when the question becomes what to do next, it's a tough one because we've had, as you well know, over 50 years of conversation about prohibition. We're well versed as to why people shouldn't have access to drugs and what we should do with them if they do have access to drugs. But we've just only started about what decriminalization would look like and what that would look like for the hemisphere. I mean, not just in Canada or the US or in Guatemala, but throughout. And so it is an open question. We wish we had tremendous answers, but we do have a platform to start that conversation.
Well, maybe the project is one way of helping spark off
exactly
the corner of that debate.
That's right.
I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, is it time for the Q&A? And
it is a Q&A moment.
It is a Q&A moment.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop talking for the moment, but just thank you both. I wish we had another hour.
Sure.
I think we could easily use it. But
That's great. Thank you,
you
John.
guys, both of you. and for
Well,
your-
thank
you.
all of you. I'm back here to help get the Q&A going. We've had a few questions come in via the Q&A as well as the chat. I want to just invite the audience. If you have questions, we have a few moments to take them. So please go ahead and put them into either the chat or the Q&A function. The first question we had, and this is for all of you, is, I mean, presumably more for the authors of the book. Did you meet any pushback from the centers with respect to interacting with patients, or did they seem completely transparent and open to you being there?
I'll say, and Benjamin, you can jump in. It was with surprising consistency that directors and pastors were very open with their centers. You can imagine communities on the margins doing the work of the state, not getting a cent from the state, and living what they believe to be a pious moral existence, being really open to people who would engage their project and ask thoughtful questions, not rush off and quickly flip potentially a story or an expose, but spend years at times asking about the intricacies of the theology and the practice behind it. There was a real rapport and trust established over these years. And I always found that once Benjamin joined the project in 2010 and entered with a camera, things became far more interesting in terms of these conversations.
Yeah, it was interesting because you would go in and people would immediately the people who ran the centers would immediately say, we're doing this work without any help from the state. So you're the first people who reached out to learn more about the work we're doing. So in that sense, it was always relatively easy conversation to have, in so much as people kind of wanted to be seen, and it was also a sort of ethical tightrope sometimes to walk when it came to understanding that our ambitions as researchers far exceeded the interests of the individual person running the center, usually a pastor. So that was always in the back of our minds.
Great. I'll go to the next question because I think this is one that any of our three guests could speak to. This is, please forgive me, we use Google Translate to get to this question, but I believe that we got the gist of it. The question is, how do you think culture and religion are influenced drug treatment? I think of shamanism in Mexico, where drugs are used like DMT and ayahuasca frequently, and it is a fundamental part of the culture. In Guatemala City, confinement gives me the impression that drugs are not welcome in the culture. So do you wonder if you have discovered any connections or trends between regional culture in Latin America and drug treatment?
John Lee, you may have reported on some of this, but I don't know, John Lee, do you find in Benji, like in the Latin American, Central American context, I find there to be a lack of hierarchy when you talk about drugs themselves, at least in the centers. So marijuana and cocaine oftentimes have the same kind of standing in terms of their moral offense within community. That, for me, that's the most striking kind of way to respond to that question. I don't know, John Lee.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm the right person for this. I'm aware of the ayahuasca treatment and others. And of course, there's a whole spectrum from the apparently authentic, and in indigenous communities deep in the Amazon, to the kind of hip, the backpacker route in Cusco, where everybody has to have an ayahuasca experience on their gap year kind of thing. One presumes somewhat more imbued with, charlataneria, a little bit more of a paid for experience. So I don't know. And I'm certainly not someone who feels, capable of giving an opinion about the rightness or wrongness of that. I wouldn't rule it out, but I don't know enough. Maybe Benjamin does. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, inside the centers, it was definitely about not having access to drugs, 100%.
It's about finding God.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say real quick that ultimately, what a lot of these people who have an illness, which is addiction, it's a chronic illness, are looking for is some sort of temporary escape from their suffering, right? And I would say that that's sort of what draws people to a lot of drugs is sort of an experience with of an altered state that allows you to kind of exceed your body and your mind and have an experience elsewhere. And I think that the way in which that manifests, at least in these urban spaces in Central America, is that the user, it becomes a figure that's scapegoated for the large array of society's ills, right? That he becomes sort of synonymous with the delinquent, with the bad guy. And it's really difficult to get people to think outside of that framework.
Nice.
Great. Next question from Susan, who says, thank you so much for this powerful event and for your work. I'm wondering whether or in what ways the language of trauma comes up in these worlds.
That's interesting. Because trauma has oftentimes been a kind of psychological framework. I mean, one of the most striking aspects of these centers is a very pared down logic of intervention, where it is being isolated and held inside of a place until you have this religious experience. And so trauma, wow, I mean, we have spent a considerable amount of time inside these centers, and trauma is not a language that immediately jumps to my mind.
Yeah, I would say oftentimes it's articulated through local idioms of understanding, discussing people's past and childhood as sort of explanatory of why they have this recurrent drug problem. Yeah. It's not identified in that psychiatric sort of category. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
I mean, oftentimes one of the strategies, you think about what would one do inside a center with 60 other people all day. One way to manage that time and that space is to have this kind of continuous train of testimonies where people would then, for months recite how, like Benjamin just said, how they got from point A to point B, and then with that kind of Christian narrative, how God would get them into a new existence. So yeah, trauma is not the language, but certainly there is a continual recitation of a past and ideally of a better future.
I would just add that often some centers would use the language of medicalization as a legitimizing factor, I would say, and use the sort of a medicalized language of addiction, but often very superficially, to the extent that at the vast majority of these institutions, there is no medical expertise on site. So there is no, there's very little by way of these sort of understandings by way of medicine.
Just to throw in a slightly provocative point, is maybe it also that language of trauma, such as we know it, something of a middle-class privilege or entitlement from people that can go to therapy. This is we're talking about people that this is a pre-therapy level of society, correct?
Yes, no, it's a perfect. That's a beautifully anthropological statement, right? The language of trauma does not exist on the margins of Guatemala City in the same way that it does in the suburbs of Chicago or St. Louis. Yeah.
And I would just add, one last thing, that the evangelical model for addiction landed on Guatemalan soil, with great strength in 1954, right, as John Lee pointed out, which was the year of the U.S. Backed coup that overthrew a democratically elected government, which had its sights on a social welfare state that included a relatively healthy health system, the vestiges of which still exist in Guatemala, but it's sort of been eroded since basically that point. There's been ups and downs. So I would say that the health system would be an alternative for people when you ask, like, why don't they have access to health, alternatives to these rehabs, if it wasn't for a particular history, right? Not to peg everything to the intervention, but that's a big factor.
Great. We have a lot of great questions coming in. We have 4 minutes. So I'm going to go through them as many as I can. But before, as people may start to need to peel off, I want to invite everybody to go to the University of Toronto Press website and buy this book, The Art of Captivity. You can also order it from a local independent bookseller near you, or frankly, Amazon.com. Just buy it. The next thing to point out to you is if you haven't noticed or hadn't heard it earlier in this, there's a really beautiful website that the authors have put together, artofcaptivity.com, with photos and more information. All right, back to the questions. Next question. Would you consider expanding your research toward Asian contexts, especially the Philippines, since it's the only Catholic-dominated Asian country that has its own demons when it comes to drugs? It might be an interesting thing to explore.
John Lee, have you ever reported? I mean, the Philippines is such an extraordinary example of the war on drugs. Have you? I have no. I mean, I spent 20 years in Guatemala City, right? I've like a focus of one, but John Lee has traveled the world.
Yeah, I grew up in Asia, actually, although I've rarely written about it. And Duterte, of course, and what he's done in the war on drugs is something that's been much on my mind over the last few years, but I've been distracted by the region, by Latin America. So I feel it's a cuenta pendiente. It's something I'd still like to do. There are so many commonalities between that country, former Spanish colony, and then America's only truly official colony after the War of 1898. And then this century of rather, upsetting history ever since. It's also a place with still several insurgencies alive. And this monstrous guy, Duterte, who's been in power with with total impunity, killing people who happen to take drugs or sell them for the last 4 or 5 years. It's pretty shocking. But no more shocking, I suppose, than the fact that we had a Donald Trump in power in the United States.
If only we had another hour to talk through that nightmare. But I mean, the thing to distinguish the Philippines and Guatemala, I mean, these centers, so the art of captivity, to hold these people for so long inside these centers, from a Christian perspective, it is kind of tough love. It is a mode of care. There is no extrajudicial executions, though incarceration is a violation of rights. So the cases are pretty different. Just to point that out. Great.
This is wonderful. It's 1:59. You hinted at the next question, which was, how has this illuminated similar trends in your own countries of residence? I think that's a good one to leave it on for everyone to sort of ponder wherever you might be. Let me just thank our really excellent speakers, our wonderful Mansueto postdoc, Benjamin. Thank you, John Lee. Thank you, Kevin. And please be sure to go buy this book from the University of Toronto Press. Go to the website, artofcaptivity.com, and we will have a posting of this whole event recorded on the Mansueto Institute's YouTube channel. Feel free to reach out to us to get that link. And thank you all so much for everything. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great project. Thanks a lot for having me on.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, John Lee. It's a pleasure.
Thanks again.